Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Well, the Vancouver Park Board tightens its rules on tent cities. How do you feel about how park encampments are being dealt with where you live? In about half an hour from now, what do former Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney, filmmaker Deepa Mehta, and former Quebec Premier Jean Charest have in common? They're some of the prominent Canadians urgently calling for better civil discourse. Have you reached out to someone with a different point of view? How can we improve our discourse? I'm Michelle Elliott. Welcome to BC Today. Thank you for joining us on CBC Radio 1, CBC Television, and live streaming on the CBC News app, cbc.ca/BC, and on the CBC Vancouver YouTube page. And you can call us now on our top story. How do you feel about how encampments are being dealt with at the city where you live? 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca or text us at 236-330-2623. Well, despite vocal opposition from speakers at last night's Park Board meeting, all of the commissioners who attended of the Vancouver Park Board at last night's meeting voted to change the bylaws on homeless encampments. Now, the new rules include a ban on putting tents under trees or within 7 meters of a beach, pond, or lake. They also expand the rights of park rangers to enter tents. They can remove a tent if it's unoccupied for more than one night. Crab Park volunteer Chloe Wells told the Park Board last night why she's opposed to the new bylaw.
Over 600 British Columbians died from the extreme heat experienced here in 2021, and equivalent climatic events are predicted to occur once every 5 years as climate change advances. Prohibiting people from seeking shelter under the shade of a tree canopy or within 7 meters of a water body, which provides significant cooling effects, is a cruel and unusual punishment that will certainly result in increased mortality of our most marginalized neighbors. The amendment to Section 11D that states temporary shelters must be occupied every night by the individual does not consider the lived experience of the people sheltering in the parks, and it puts an unnecessary amount of increased stress on these users. This rule would bar any resident from seeking employment that would require them to work night shifts. A resident who may need medical attention could be discouraged from seeking care because they know that a night in the hospital would result in them losing all of their possessions.
That was Chloe Wells, a volunteer at Vancouver's Crab Park Tent Encampment. She was speaking last night at a Vancouver Park Board meeting. And we're asking you on the open line, how do you feel about how park encampments are being dealt with in your part of the province? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. And here in Vancouver, we're joined by Angela Hare, a Vancouver Park Board Commissioner, for more. Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Back in September 2020, the Park Board made amendments to this bylaw to allow for temporary overnight sheltering, and that was in response to the housing crisis. So why are these changes needed now?
Well, thank you for the question. In previous weeks or in the past weeks, we've seen that the situation's become very dire. And as you can see, there's been fires, and they've found contents, including hair spray cans, propane tanks, needles, stuff that is hazardous and dangerous to the health of those that are residing there. So they had to make urgent changes to the bylaws.
Okay, and so what changes in the bylaws address that?
Sure. I mean, there's certain things that they've done. For example, making sure that the tents are an X amount of meters away from bodies of water. That ensures that the tents and belongings don't get soaked and wet. That's for their safety, including not having them put their tents underneath trees. That's in prevention of fire. Like, it's a fire hazard if something goes on. Like, a lot of the tents, they have heaters, propane tanks. People are lighting things on fire within the tents. If you're residing underneath a tree, that's just increasing the likelihood of a fire. So in working in conjunction with the fire department, VPD, and other bodies and stakeholders, they came up with this plan moving forward to to ensure that there's more safety and regulation moving forward.
How does imposing further restrictions on what people there can have, how does that really address the matter? Are there not other ways to ensure the safety, for example, having proper disposal places for those flammable materials rather than
That's,
restricting what they can put in?
I know, look, they originally allowed for overnight encampments, and then especially considering the weather, maybe that's why they did that, but it didn't work. And there's a lot of if you had a chance to actually visit Crab Park, there's feces, there's rats, materials, people's belongings are getting soaked. There's illegal objects or things within the tents as well. And the situation is not good. It's not good for the people that are residing there.
And so, how do these changes address that then?
Sure, putting stricter regulations and ensuring the safety will
Like
help
which
them.
regulations? Which regulations would address, feces, for example?
Well, we're trying to what they're trying to clean up. They're trying to clean up the areas and parks. They're trying to also, for example, Director Betty and with other staff members, they're working in conjunctions with places like the Covenant House, trying to transition them with dignity into safer housing. So the idea is not to keep people on the streets. We want to transition them into better housing, better and safe places to live. So a lot of people, they were not, it's not hygienic. The places are not equipped to house people. The parks were originally there and the bylaws were there for visiting, right? They were
Right.
visiting, people come with their kids, they come with their seniors, they come with their dogs. So originally the bylaws that were intact were for people that are visiting the parks. So they had to make stricter regulations because now people are encamping. So we have to just look at the safety and how people are residing there and what we can do to make sure it's a clean and safe space as well.
What kind of expanded rights will there be for park rangers? Would there be then increased surveillance of people living there?
They will. So originally it wasn't in writing what they can do because they've never had to put anything in writing. This is not, I mean, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's been going on for a little while now. But they're giving the rangers a little bit more rights just in case there may be a safety issue. For example, they're able to, with notice, be able to go into someone's tent, right? So this is something new
With
that they never
notice.
had. Yeah, with notice, of course. You have to still respect these are, look, coming from a place of privilege, we have houses, we rent places, we're surrounded by people. A lot of people residing there have mental health issues, they're addicted to drugs, they don't have the support system always, but they're human beings and they need to be treated with lots of dignity and respect.
And so, in light of that, with 4,821 people unhoused in Metro Vancouver, half of them in the city of Vancouver, given
Yes.
you're right, the lack of housing to address the needs of these residents, is it a time to reimagine what parks are for? You talk about what they're, the need for them to be used as recreation. Is there a way that they can be reimagined so they serve all of those needs for people to be able to enjoy and for people who have nowhere else to go to be able to stay?
That's a great question. I moved the motion yesterday and, but we also had some amendments and the amendments were just as important as the moving the motion. And the chair, addressed this and we have to work across the board with stakeholders, with the province and federal government as well to bring in more housing for people who are homeless. So this is not a one-day solution, right?
But what about
There's
at parks? What role can parks play in that?
Right. What we're doing is we're trying to bring in a more hygienic, as you can see, they brought in more hygienic spaces for some of the people who are tented as well. But parks are meant to be parks. And what we're trying to do is work in correlation with, again, if you looked at the amendments, with the fire department, with VPD, we're reaching out to the city of Vancouver, obviously, and also province and federal government for more funding. We are not in governance of housing. It's a park board. We're in governance of parks, right? This is what we're supposed to be governing. And parks are supposed to be for everyone. It's supposed to be accessible. It's supposed to be clean. It's supposed to be safe on top of that. Now the situation's gotten so bad. There's fires that are being caught, and a lot of people do not feel safe attending the parks. So we are reaching out to the other stakeholders to get help. And we're going to be working in correlation with all the other stakeholders to make sure that it's not going to be solved overnight either. I'm not going to say tomorrow there'll be a miracle. No, it's going to take time.
Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Commissioner.
Thank you for having me.
Angela Hare is a Vancouver Park Board Commissioner. And we're asking you on the open line, how do you feel about how park encampments are being dealt with in your city? This is in light of a unanimous vote last night among Park Board members who were in attendance at the meeting to tighten restrictions and rules at park encampments within the city of Vancouver, and they include things like not being able to bring certain building materials, for example, not being able to erect a tent under a tree, not being able to camp at certain parks like Queen Elizabeth Park. Asking you, how do you feel about how these encampments are being dealt with where you live in your part of the province? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. By email, it's bctoday@cbc.ca. Rain is calling us from Vancouver. Hi, Rain. Thanks very much for calling. What do you think of how park encampments and tent cities are being dealt with?
Well, I kind of think that with what's going on with the new statements, it's just kind of stating the obvious, because a lot of us self-police ourselves, and we know not to, have open fires in our tents, and we self, it's a community. I mean, because of the housing crisis, a lot of people that are in these encampments are there because they can't afford to. My friend works for TD and he lives in a van. It's getting that. But I find the Parks Board, it's just kind of like it just doesn't look good in the media. I don't know if it's the new mayor and everything that they got to do. Because remember, way back we had Gregor Robertson, who was really good to us, trying to end homelessness in 2015. But I think they got together, but I don't feel we were. I didn't know it was on there. The meeting was going on, or else I would have been in attendance.
And you talk about this kind of self-policing, and former Mayor Gregor Robertson, made that campaign promise to end homelessness. It didn't happen, obviously.
No.
But what the commissioner raised there was, concern around. We do hear about fires, despite the efforts to try and police and try to stay safe and have proper use of propane tanks. They do still happen. So what do you make of these efforts to try and sort of increase safety, as they call it?
I think it's trying to make a mountain out of a molehill. I mean, a lot of these new tent warming systems require propane to get them to heat, and a lot of us. You'll always get that one person that doesn't follow the rules, right? And it takes one bad seed just spoils the broth, right? And they fall asleep when they're using these torches that are like way too powerful, and someone falls asleep and the tent burns down.
And Rain, can you tell me a bit about? I mean, it sounds like you do have personal experience.
Yeah, I was at Strathcona. I was at the Oppenheimer Park, in the encampment. Well, and I felt safer there than I did when I was on the street. I was on the street for 6 years. The only reason why I had got housing now is because I got run over by a big BC Hydro truck, and I lost half my foot, or else I'd still probably be living in alleyways or in these encampments. And I know a lot of people that live in them, and a lot of it seems like every time we get a new set of rules come up, it's just kind of stating the obvious. Like with the Parks Board and the Commissioner, they are really good to us, but I find it's the upper levels that tend to put tie their hands behind their back and restate the same thing, because not everybody knows it. No one ever lives it, right? And there's people that are successful living in vans, just because of the housing crisis.
Sure. And Rain, can you tell me a little bit about, she talked about sort of the tensions that there can be when park staff are trying to enforce rules and things like that. What was your own interaction like with?
They were aggressive. Well, I had two sides of the coin. One, they'd come in to be aggressive. You're trying to get your stuff together, and they're rushing you. So you're, spending more time arguing, turning around and communicating with them and getting your stuff ready. You know, if they had just leave you alone to pack up and go, you would have gone. But they have to come over and be like, "Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" And they can be imposing. They're bigger guys, and they're usually wearing some sort of flak vest, which does look imposing. But other side of the coin is I've had them, help me out. I found me in the park once with my rat freezing, and they helped me get some clothes and rat food, and gave me a way to find, shelterless and get a little bit of food. So it just depends on the person, But really, as a whole, like lately, it's been us versus them. It's been it's like a secondary police system, right? We got VPD to deal with, And
I have one more question for you, Rain. I'm so glad that you called, and thank you very much for sharing your experience. We heard the commissioner say, they're responsible for parks. They're trying to work with the other levels of government and other agencies here. What in Vancouver, you say that things have changed. What would you say to Vancouver City Council, for example, to the provincial government? What is your message?
We need some more. We need affordable housing. And we also know that some things are common sense. We know to say if there's a kid coming on, if there's a kid coming on the block, we yell "kid on the block," and everybody stops anything that's like sorted, right? And we don't want to live on Tennyson Street. It's a lot of it. We just don't have and also some of us have criminal records and can't get work. Maybe if they found a way to get some people I know people on the streets that have skills and degrees. Why don't they be tapping into that resource?
Rain, and you're in an SRO right now?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, all the best to you, okay? And I hope that you recover from your foot injury.
I'm working on it. But I used to manage SROs before this, so it's kind of like the shoes on the other foot. So.
Well, I hope you call again. Thanks so much for joining us today. That's Rain in Vancouver, asking you how you feel about how park encampments are being dealt with in your part of the province, whatever city you live in. It's an issue, of course, that does traverse all throughout BC. And our numbers are 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. Let's head to Port Clements, and Casimir is on the line. Hi, Casimir. Is this an issue you face there?
Yes, hi. How are you?
I am just fine. Glad you called. What are your thoughts?
Good. So fire is a big deal in our part of the province here because we were surrounded by forest. Mm-hmm. In Port Clements, we have about 250 population. I know there's about 3 million in Vancouver. I hear there's about 5,000 roughly homeless, which is about 0.17%. We had one homeless last year. That was 0.4% for Port Clements. So in terms of absolute numbers, we had one homeless. In terms of percentage numbers, we're like double what Vancouver had, just by having one person homeless.
Right. And
that one person, where they were homeless, they were camping. They were just above the high tide zone, and they had a little campfire. And that was last year. And, the town cracked down on that person. Now, that person has since found a home to live in, mm-hmm. and he's a local now, and he lives in that house. He rents it out. But that person experienced homelessness when they first arrived. And, what do I feel about the rules where I live? We have to pay attention to safety. And we could have talked to him in a gentler way and guided him to a better location where he could actually safely be homeless. Mm. But we didn't. Unfortunately, the way our town responded was, no, you can't stay there. You've broken rules, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what I see in Vancouver. I see the town of Vancouver is saying, no, you guys are breaking all the rules. You're living in the wrong place. You can't live here. You have to move, instead of saying, hey, I have a better solution for you. And here's a place where you can live and be safe. And that's what I'm looking for Vancouver. I lived in Vancouver for 20 years, from 1991 through to 2010.
Some big changes there throughout those 2 decades, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of changes, but certainly when I first moved to New West, there were homeless people, and they were living near the SkyTrain, and then they got pushed. The New West pushed them out to Surrey, East Vancouver pushed those people to New West, pushed them out to Surrey, pushed them out to
So it's an
Langley.
issue
I've
of
watched that happen over the decades.
moving the issue, yeah.
Yeah, so when somebody new comes to town, we're a small town, so we know who that person is, and most of us try to work with them to help them find a solution that's best. But in the big city, those people, they just get swallowed up, they get forgotten. I'm talking about 0.17% of the population of Vancouver. Vancouver's got about 3 million people now. And you said something about 4,800 or 5,000
throughout Metro
homeless?
Vancouver, yeah.
Yeah, that's 0.17%. That is
Okay.
such a small percentage of the population that they get forgotten, they get left over.
Casimir,
And this is the thing.
yeah.
That's,
I hear your point, and you're applying your experience and what you observed in Port Clements to what you would like to see in Vancouver as well, having lived here. Really good to hear from you. Thank you very much. That's Casimir joining us from Port Clements. 12:27 now, 1:27 in the Mountain Time Zone. More of your calls coming up, but right now it is 12:27 and 1:27 in the Mountain Time here on BC Today. We're going to go back to your calls in just a moment, but lots more of BC's top stories coming up on CBC Radio throughout the afternoon. In Metro Vancouver, here's what's coming up on the Coast at 3 o'clock.
Michelle, hi there. It's Gloria Makarenko here, inviting you to stay with us for On the Coast this afternoon on CBC Radio. We're continuing our conversation this week on autism and what a diagnosis can mean for adults. We'll hear from a doctor and the director of the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Lab at Simon Fraser University coming up. Also, a young Ukrainian pianist left his home country after the Russian invasion. And this week, he will be performing a concert for peace here in Metro Vancouver. So we will hear from him, and we've got some tickets to give away to the concert as well. I hope you can join us between 3 and 6 for On the Coast.
Thank you very much, Gloria. We will be listening. Some emails coming now on what to do about park encampments. Janice writes, homeless people should not be camping in our city parks. It is dangerous for them and also dangerous for the general public. Maybe our provincial government will at last realize that people with disabilities need care in hospitals or facilities that treat them, not give them free drugs to keep their habit going. Poor souls who for some reason become homeless should be given safe accommodation and help to get their lives back together. Marjorie writes, I don't have the answer to this problem, but it is obvious we're talking about two issues and conflating both the problem and the solutions. It's not just people who cannot afford an apartment. It's also people who have a drug habit and or mental health issues. It would help if everybody looked at these issues separately. Thank you for weighing in by email. Our address is bctoday@cbc.ca. We're asking you how you feel about how park encampments are being dealt with in your city. And Tim is joining us from Kamloops. Hi, Tim. Welcome.
Hi there.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think a lot of it has been pretty much covered by your guests, especially the last comment about there are a couple of issues kind of merged together. Like I said, those who have issues with substance abuse and can't get, or addiction, and as well actually affordability of a place. But I think what the thing is, as I was saying to your screen, I think this is going to be a status quo for a while to come, because if there's no political will on all levels of government or the private sector to look at zoning areas for this kind of thing, so you don't want the issues raised in parks and the issues that are brought about in parks, then this is only going to become a circle over and over and over again. I don't see any solution to it. Because you've got political parties of different ideologies and all that pull yourself up by the bootstraps kind of thing and so forth. So I just think you better just get used to more of what's been happening, I would say at least for probably the next 10 to 20 years. I don't, unless you're going to, as I said, a convergence of governments and private sector to do anything, and because of the issue of affordability, I think you're just going to see this is just going to be the normal.
Tim, thank you very much. On that dire note, thank you for the call. Good to hear from you. That's Tim joining us from Kamloops. Thanks so much for all of your calls. In fact, as he talks about convergence on certain issues, we're going to talk about public discourse and civil discourse. How do we find that common ground? How do we handle differences of opinion and viewpoints? We're going to talk about that in light of an open letter that was just published in the Globe and Mail last week. We'll have two guests joining us who are experts in civil discourse and polarization. We'd love to hear from you. How can we improve discourse? What's something that you've done to try and reach out to someone with a different view? We'll have that conversation coming up after the CBC News Update. And here's Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. Police are asking for help trying to find a family of 6 who may be here in BC. The RCMP in Alberta say 39-year-old Winnie Manny and her 5 kids were last heard from nearly a week ago. Their abandoned vehicle was found in Calgary last month. Investigators believe the family may be in southern BC, but did not give any more details. The City of Surrey has released its draft 5-year budget. It includes a 6% property tax increase, as well as funding for sports complexes and other amenities. Mayor Brenda Locke says the biggest financial challenge remains the transition to a municipal police force. Meanwhile, the province says Surrey must decide by 4 this afternoon on its offer from the government to help with that police transition. And the provincial government says low-income seniors will be getting a one-time $430 benefit that will go toward paying rent. Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon says eligible seniors will receive the benefit this month. Kahlon says the province has also expanded the eligibility to include seniors with annual incomes of about $37,000 or below. And now the forecast on the north coast, mainly cloudy this afternoon with a high of 7. Highs to 10 degrees with some strong winds and sunshine in the Peace. In the central interior, a mix of sun and cloud with a high of 8. Highs from 10 to 13 and mainly cloudy in the West Kootenay. Sunny breaks in the East Kootenay. In the southern interior, a chance of showers with a high of 14. And mainly cloudy in the Fraser Valley, a mix of sun and cloud in Metro Vancouver and Greater Victoria with highs around 13 degrees. That's your CBC News Update from Vancouver.
Thank you very much, Rob. And I think yesterday's, big solar eclipse was one of those moments, at least mostly in the eastern part of the country. Where were you when that kind of moment, right?
It was.
It really was. I don't know if you saw, but there was a marriage proposal at Niagara.
I did not.
Yes,
Exciting.
It was very sweet. We looked over at the camera and there was someone on bended knee and the couple was hugging and kissing afterwards. So
pretty memorable.
Yeah, I mean,
wow.
what a story to tell
Good
at
timing.
your wedding.
Mm-hmm.
The stars lined up.
They did. Sort of. Not really the stars, but yes.
One star and one moon, I guess. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. So there you go. Maybe people are thinking about how extravagant their own proposal will be. You always try to line up.
The next eclipse is in 20 years, right?
Yes.
So plan ahead now. Say if you're like 8 or 9, so plan ahead for that.
You have time to save up for the ring, at least.
That's right.
Rob, thanks so much.
Sure.
It's Rob Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. And speaking of memorable, we asked you what are the most memorable sun events that you have witnessed, sky events rather. And Layla wrote us, I saw the eclipse in Manitoba in 1978. We got a few calls on that eclipse, actually. But Layla writes, even more impressive to me are the northern lights I see almost nightly when I was growing up in northern Manitoba. My favorite were red. They were rare, but when they were dancing around the sky, I loved it. When my friends would visit, we would say, watch, and we'll make them move. And we'd whistle and they would dance. Of course, we weren't actually controlling it, but it was a fun trick. Oh, that is a great story, Layla. Thanks so much for sharing that. BC Today at cbc.ca. Today on CBC, we are on CBC Radio 1, CBC Television, and live streaming on our website, cbc.ca/BC, as well as on the CBC News app and on YouTube at CBC Vancouver. And you can call us now on our topic for this part of the program. We're asking you, how can we improve civil discourse? And what are your stories of trying to reach out to someone with a differing point of view? Do you have any friends who are of a different political leaning? Tell us about that. You can call us now, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And by email, bctoday@cbc.ca. You can also text us at 236-330-2623. Well, from Bank of Canada Governor Mark Carney to filmmaker Deepa Mehta to former Quebec Premier Jean Charest, 51 prominent Canadians have all signed an open letter to current Canadian leaders to, quote, address urgently the rise of incivility. Now, the letter was published in the Globe and Mail last week, and in it they write, quote, Canadians with different perspectives and lived experiences need to be working together instead of retreating to the familiarity of our echo chambers to lob hurtful tropes at one another, end quote. Now, they're calling for things like researching the causes and impact of tensions in Canada and instilling the ability to engage in constructive dialogue and protecting free expression and strong viewpoints while strengthening awareness of what constitutes hate speech. Now, this issue of incivility and polarization certainly isn't new these days. And so we're asking you, how do you think we can improve civil discourse? What's your own story of trying to reach out to someone with a different point of view? And do you have friends outside your political leanings? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. You can also email bctoday@cbc.ca. And I have two guests now for this conversation who study the problem of polarization and uncivil discourse. Joining us on Zoom, Jenny Barron is Executive Director of the Mir Center for Peace. And with me in studio is Aftab Irfan, Executive Director of the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue. Good afternoon to both of you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for the invitation.
Jenny, what did you think of the letter?
Well, I largely agreed with the points. I think that they are calling for some really important things. Research, we've been doing some research at the Mir Center for Peace together with Vancouver Community College and Capilano University on this. And, we found that there's actually been a fair bit of research done in this area already and some really good educational programs developed. That's not to say that there shouldn't be more, but yeah, so we can look to what's been done and we can come together to work on these things. We also know that dialogue works when people are educated in good practices, or sometimes for group dialogue, if it's well structured and facilitated, it really, really can make a difference.
And what have you found through that research in partnership with Capilano and Vancouver Community College? What have you found is the root of all of this?
Well, if we're talking about the root of polarization, I think inequality is a fundamental one, and perceptions of threat. And that's not what people think typically. They usually think, well, it's social media or it's polarizing leaders, and they do play a role, but they are better thought of as sort of accelerants or amplifiers of polarization that comes from people feeling very, very insecure.
Okay, I'd love to delve into that a little bit more as well later on, that sort of feeling of a risk to your own sense of safety, community, and personal safety. And to you, Aftab, how do you see the issue of polarization?
Well, I think it's very present, and I agree with what's being said about fear being definitely a root cause. I think maybe just to bring in social media, we might as well, because it's going to be part of this conversation.
Right.
I do.
Someone's tweeting at us right now. So,
somebody is, yes.
On X, rather.
Yes, yeah. I feel like we are in a moment where many of us are tempted to, or kind of incentivized to, become these brands online, and the kind of quality of a brand is to be very consistent. You don't change your mind. You state things very strongly. You stick with what you've said before, and I think that's polarizing. That is kind of the opposite of being in dialogue, which requires you to think and and change your mind every once in a while. So I think there's something kind of societally going on that is contributing here as well.
That's really interesting. So is there a difference between that genuine fear, that genuine passion for an issue versus perhaps someone who has a brand, is exploiting those fears?
I tend to think some of that is probably happening. And I think it's important to say the fears are legitimate and a brand might be about all kind of promoting this fear, or a brand might be about dismissing that fear. And I think we're seeing both of those things, and it's not super conducive to civility, if you will.
Yeah, and how does that affect then the core concerns, Jenny, the core fears, as Aftab was saying, not to dissuade people from looking at the root fears and the root concerns, but how does that take away from the actual issue?
Well, I'm not sure if it's the differences themselves, like those actual issues, that are the problem. There's this tendency to feel like we have to belong to camps, and that we've created this sense of camps, and with that an oversimplification, so that we've lost the complexity of a lot of issues, and there's this pressure to belong, to fit in, to not dissent within your own group. And so we have to take a whole slate of ideas. And I think that we lose the complexity. And that's one of the things that we really need to bring back, along with civility, of course.
That two things can be, you can feel two things at the same time that may not, one may not belong in your so-called camp. What are your thoughts on that, Aftab?
I think it's one of the healthiest ways of having conflict is to have internal conflict, that kind of like disagreeing with myself, and resisting that tendency to join a camp too quickly. I think it's true, and the more fearful we are, the more we are likely to want the security of being with others, thinking with others, being with others. But I think if we lose the ability to think clearly. I mean, thinking is literally having an internal dialogue with yourself, kind of acknowledging the different points of view within yourself. And we need to become more practiced at that.
Well, it's interesting. One of the 8 recommendations in this letter is, partly that sort of instilling in all generations, as it says, of Canadians, respect for and the ability to engage in constructive dialogue. And so if someone were to take away from this letter, if they agree with it, that there is this issue with polarization and what you're saying about the need for that nuance to be able to question and critique your own stances as well, what can people take away from perhaps our conversation now and from this letter?
Mm-hmm. So I love the line in the letter that's asking for the federal government to fund and support the development of curriculum at all levels, including in post-secondary, which is, of course, where I sit. I do think there is ways of teaching this content in the classroom, and the way to do it is to do it through experiential education. There isn't really kind of a book that you can read to have all these answers. It's more like a muscle that you develop, and I do think that is something that we can all do. It's kind of like, what are some safe enough spaces that I can develop my muscle? What is the equivalent of a gym where I go to work out, that is with folks who at some level I have some relationship with, that is stable. Maybe I know that they love me and basically accept me, and we have differences. I think those are the good places to practice some of these skills.
Like a dinner table, perhaps, or
a dinner table, depending on what dinner table. But yes, so folks who aren't going to throw tomatoes at you, but are willing to be in a conversation that you can get to know each other and explore things together.
Jenny, how can a regular British Columbian Canadian exercise that muscle for dialogue?
Well, I'd say there are a number of different muscles, and one of them is curiosity. And it's hard, but try to restrain the impulse to assert something or argue, and ask a question instead. If you can delay entering into debate mode, even by 1 or 2 exchanges, you're doing better. And one thing to try to keep in mind is say, okay, well, my primary task here is not to tell them what I think, but to figure out how they think. And, paradoxically, your chances of influencing someone they're probably greatest when you're not trying to change their mind, or not at least so aggressively that they're going to put up defenses.
Wow, these are such
So that's one muscle.
Yes, no, very interesting points. My guests are Aftab Irfan, Executive Director of the Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue, and Jenny Barron is Chair of the Mirror Center for Peace, joining us from Castlegar. We're asking you, how can we improve civil discourse? And you can tell us about your experience reaching out to someone with a differing point of view. And do you have any friends who have different political leanings from you? You can give us a call, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. Elliot is calling us from Salt Spring Island. Hi, Elliot, welcome.
Hi.
Yes, tell us, do you have experience with, reaching out and expanding your circle?
Well, I'm queer and trans and very leftist, and have been, since I went to university, I guess, in my early 20s. I'm in my 40s now, but my best friend who I grew up with, we've known each other since we were 10, and she's like polar opposites of me in terms of politics. She's like, I know she's not going to hear this because she would never listen to the CBC. She's like super conservative, and but her mom was always like very supportive of me, and we talk every day, and I know that she supports me and cares about my well-being, and I know that I care about her and her well-being.
Wow, how do you bridge the differences between the two of you?
Well, I will say I don't actually engage with her online stuff because when I see it, I'm like, oh my gosh. And sometimes I I mute, or, so I don't need to really see her thoughts on certain things.
And does she do the same for you? Do you know?
We've never really talked about it. We have talked about how we're grateful that we and also how we love that in this day and age, how there's so many people that are super polarized, that we've always been there for each other and care for each other. And that we like that we're we can still care for each other, even though we really believe in opposite things.
Wow, what an example.
Yeah. I guess we don't try to change each other's minds.
Aha. That's just what we've heard about, isn't it?
On some things.
What do you think people can take away from you and your friend's experience?
That's a good question. I guess just when it comes down to it, I like to believe that she cares about my well-being, and if she can care about my well-being, then my hope is that most people are just trying to do the right thing, and they're trying to be good people.
Elliot, so glad to hear from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Take care.
What an example. That's Elliot on Salt Spring Island. Any responses? You were saying, oh, amazing.
I love that story.
Yeah.
I think, and what an act of generosity to stay in a relationship like that, because it would be much easier to say, I'll block you. I just won't have any conversation. I think that exercise of humanizing another person, having at least one human connection on the other side of issues that are polarized in our society, it goes a long ways. And it's interesting. I feel like, on the one hand, I totally feel this impulse to not get into the things, just kind of accept we're going to live next to each other. It's called pluralism in the kind of the discourse about this sometimes. And I think at the same time, in some ways, I think we, not necessarily in the context of this story, but sometimes we give up too easily on each other. There's also a kind of tendency to say, well, that's just those people, and they will never change. And so I think these kinds of bridges make it possible every once in a while to at least test the validity of our own thinking, be exposed to how others are thinking about, see data that they're looking at that's probably different from what we are looking at. So there could be those windows between the two. So I would say if we can keep those kinds of relationships, it's a good example of where we know we are basically loved and accepted, and we can explore a little bit.
A little bit of dialogue. And what about you, Jenny? What did you take from Elliot's call?
Oh, so many things. I mean, building relationships across difference is really key. I don't think you can have really meaningful dialogue without some kind of connection. And the more you care about somebody first, the better able you're going to be to listen to them and consider what they're saying, and to use that muscle, that curiosity, and also the humility to be able to say, well, okay, maybe I don't know everything, or maybe I don't understand. I certainly don't understand why this person believes what they believe, but I'd like to. So the relationship, that's really, really important. And also that idea of not giving up, like what you were just saying, not giving up on sometimes trying to persuade somebody. I think there is a place for that. There's an author that I'm fond of, Anand Giridharadas, and he says, persuasion is essential to democracy. So if we just retreat into our echo chambers and we decide that other people it's not worth the time or the effort, or they'll never change, they'll never understand, he says we're actually showing contempt for them. So it's a rather hopeless position to be in. And, he says instead, let's persuade, but let's be open to them trying to persuade us too. And remember that that's not the same as just being railroaded. We have agency. We can choose whether to remain unpersuaded or whether to say, wow, gee, that's something new. I hadn't considered that before. And, maybe our views in the main will be unchanged, but some of the details, some of the finer points, they can shift, or we just come to understand the other person better, which has value in itself too. It doesn't have to feel like a fight just because we're trying to persuade.
Okay, no throwing tomatoes at the dinner table. I do want to get into that as well, because how do you approach that, right? With friends or relatives you want to have these interactions with and perhaps don't agree. But we have an email here I want to read to you. And Emma is writing us, all elected officials need communication training and support to change the embedded system. And yes, this open letter from 51 prominent Canadians, artists and writers and musicians and former politicians and whatnot, they're addressing this to Canadian leaders and political leaders. But what do they need in order to be the examples themselves, as Emma is urging, communication training and changing perhaps I guess what Emma might be referring to as the sort of adversarial system. But what can leaders do, I guess, is the question. Jenny?
Well, I think the leaders often respond to what they think we want, right? And so I would maybe turn the question around and say, more of us need to say, we're sick of this, mudslinging that goes on and calls itself politics. And we really want people to focus on, our elected leaders to focus on the issues of the day and, reward civility, reward respect and integrity. And, that it's going to have to come from us as well as them. I would say, training is one thing, and we can only go so far because it's a culture shift that needs to happen. And it's the incentives. There are far too many sort of social and political incentives to doing that kind of mudslinging. And so that's why I think we have a role to play too in changing that incentive structure.
Okay. Is there enough incentive to change that structure after?
That's a good question. I think there's this thing that is said about conflict, is that the deep-rooted conflicts are never resolved. They're only made irrelevant by a higher truth. And I think we are somewhat in that territory of the higher truth is we are really damaging each other. We are hurting each other. In some cases, we are finding each other. We are doing violence to each other. All of that is happening. So if we can get in touch with that higher truth, maybe that's part of the incentive. I do also, this question reminds me of, I used to be the chief equity officer for the city of Vancouver. And so I often will sit in council chambers when conversations were happening and members of the public were there and councillors were commenting on things. And I did also find that, like many of us, a lot of the elected officials are sometimes unaware of the impact of what they're saying on how it's landing for other people. And so to do some training for them, but to actually just be able to say to them at the end of the day, while it's still kind of fresh, to say, how that might have landed, or, you had this person in front of you and you said, just to kind of be able to adjust and give that feedback before it blows up and becomes a major thing. I thought was very helpful. And politicians don't have a lot of support in this kind of way. I mean, they might get a training at the beginning of their term, but we are talking about changing culture and changing habits. So it might be something that is more forgiving and more constant to help make some of those corrections.
Okay. We are heading into, some elections. And what are some practical things? I know I moderated a panel which you spoke at AFTAB, and some of the questions were just like, how can I make a friend who is of a different political viewpoint than me? What are some practical bits you can have for how we can be civil and have discussions civilly with our neighbors, with our relatives? What would you like to see?
Mm-hmm. The one thing that we haven't yet said that comes to my mind is the age of misinformation and just the different things that we are reading and information that we have access to. I had a recent example happen to me when I got into an argument with somebody, and they tried to say that we don't need feminism anymore, that it's actually men who are suppressed now. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, all the stuff I'm looking at is pointing in the other direction. And then I asked them what specific data they're actually looking at. Like, where is this coming from? And they pointed to research that is about boys in school and how the school system is in some ways underserving young men. And I looked at the research, and it's completely valid, and it is true. It doesn't necessarily mean that now we don't need feminism anymore, but there's some truth to what they're saying. And I feel like grounding it in information, where is it coming from? Is it misinformation? And I think I often assume that my opponent has misinformation, but sometimes it's actually true.
Okay.
So taking that time to look at what they're actually reading.
And how did I have about 20 seconds left? But how did that argument, as you called it, reconcile or end?
I mean, at the moment, I just asked, what are you looking at? And I went and looked at it afterwards. And I sent them a note to say, I see what you mean.
Okay, I see what you mean.
In this area, it's true. There is something about schools, yeah.
I just have 15 seconds left, Jenny, but I see what you mean. Is that a phrase perhaps we should all learn?
I think I never thought of it that way. It's a good one too. Yeah.
So great. I hope that we get to talk to you again, because I think we're just starting the conversation around this. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Jenny Varon, Chair at the Mir Center for Peace, and Aftab Irfan, Executive Director of the Morris Wass Center.